Welcome to the Getting Started guide for the Storming Leech interactive dialogue game engine. I've already begun by importing my asset into a brand new game, and now I'm going to add all and click import. Once that's done, there's not very many steps before you can get started using the engine. I would certainly recommend bringing in any graphics that you already know you intend to use, so I'm going to drop a couple of character graphics into the sprites area, and then maybe I'll drop a sound asset into the sounds area, and maybe a background file that will go in sprites as well. These are all assets that are going to become available to me as I'm doing my editing. Also, if I have any fonts that I want to use, I can add those as well, but the engine does come with a couple built in. Now to set up the engine to actually use, I'm going to go into my rooms and launch room 0. And I'm going to set a background just so that I can tell what's going on. I'll use this as a background. And then the important part is that I'm going to bring in one of the objects, and in this case the editing object. This will allow me to run the engine. That's all that it takes to get set up. You drop in the editing object and you run the game. When the game begins, you'll see the room that I had placed my editing object inside of, and then you'll also see a whole interface that's been added over the top. Now I could be doing this editing inside of my actual game project, or I could create a new game project that's got the same size room or camera view setup, and then work from there and import everything into my actual game once the editing process is complete. Or I can do a mix as I go along. To get started, I want to go through the 3 sections of primary content that you can add: dialogue, characters, and choices. Each of these works in a similar way. You'll notice that each of the add buttons are grayed out because I haven't defined anything that can be added. All of the dialogue goes inside of styled boxes, all of the characters use preset characters, and choices use styled boxes that are very much like the dialog boxes. So let's go to the dialog area first, and I'm going to go to the text box styles. Immediately, the default style is created and some basic ideas are set up here. I can choose images to choose as a background, so if I have a fancy drawn box, I can use shapes with right now rectangle or round rectangle. You'll notice that rounds the corners off, and I'll add more to these later. And then there's also some pieces of content that I can add that are customizable back in the engine itself. So I can add an area where an avatar would go. I can modify the text area. I can add a graphic that would be something like a button or a bouncing icon or something that says to continue or really whatever I want. And I can add a label, which is basically a second text area. And that's the kind of thing that you'll frequently see when you have multiple characters talking, and the label area would be something that shows who is speaking for that particular box. For each of these areas, the editing works similarly. You select the area you want to edit, and then set the options you want to change. I can change the color, the opacity, and as you saw with some of these, even the roundedness and so on. I'm going to set this box back to white, maybe make it a little bit more solid, and then I'll go to my text area, and I do recommend defining a font. If the font is undefined, then it will use whatever font happens to be active at the moment that the box is being drawn. This can be different depending on how your game is working, and even here in the editor depending on which menus happen to be active. So I would recommend deciding what font you want to use. I'll center my box, and I'll change the text area to be just a little bit inside the boundaries so that I've got kind of a border on the edges. You can drag these sides, or there's also an option to just completely redraw the text area with this option. I'm not going to use a label for now, so I'll click on Label and toggle that area off. And that's my basic style. You'll notice that I'm working on the default style, and I could add more styles, copying the current or starting with the default again, and name them as I like so I can set up multiple boxes. I can also come back and edit these styles at any time, and if I've already got one, I can hide the grid and see what it's doing live in the game. So now when I go back to Dialog, you'll notice that I can add a new text box, and there it is with the style applied. You'll see that I could go back to text box styles, change something like the font, and now when I go back to my dialogue, it's changed. If I want to move the box, I hold down the Control key, and you'll see that I've got some guides on the screen that will help me line things up. And so I'm going to drag that down to the middle in the center just like that. And when I let go, there it is. For now I'm going to leave my other text options alone, but you see I can remove a text box, add a second text, and as many texts as I want. I can change the style to any other boxes I might have. I can override the default alignment for that box. I can set an avatar if I have a region for that. I can set the text for the label. I can determine whether or not the text should type itself out or appear all at once. And then these last two buttons will erase all the text in the box or bring up an editor. I don't actually recommend using this as a typing box because sometimes the engine, when it's got a lot going on in edit mode, can lag a little bit. It's not a lot, but you'll find that when you're typing really fast, sometimes it misses characters. It's much easier to go in here and use it for insertion editing, or deleting sections, or adding any of these tags, or pasting in parts of your script. Next, I want to add a character. So I'm going to go up to Characters, and again, I've got to make one first. So we'll do Make, and I'll create a new character. And I'll click OK. Now we're editing the demo character, default expression, layer 0, and there's nothing yet. So I'm going to choose an image, and I've named all of my images with underscores so that the menus automatically navigate through them. And there's my image. At this point, I could stop there, but I'm going to define a second expression for the character. So I'll click plus, type the name of the expression, click OK, and choose that expression. Now that I'm editing it, I have to make some changes. So I'm going to go to my layer and turn it on. You'll notice that by default, the layer's visibility is set off, but I'll toggle that on, and I'll put another graphic into layer 1, and it's up here in the corner. Again, we'll control click and drag. Holding the control key allows me to position, and I'll get that about where it needs to be and let go. Now, if you've been working in something like Photoshop, you could go and find the coordinates and just put them in here and position it very precisely. And you'll notice that because I added this layer and turned it on while I was working on my first expression, my default expression has that layer turned off, and so now I've effectively created two expressions that draw one or both layers combined. You can make expressions that have any combination of layers. There's one graphic per layer, and you can define as many expressions as you want. They're called expressions, but you could also have things like a change of clothes or any other kind of appearance or category you want. Now I'll go back to Characters, add a character, and of course the default comes up. If I had multiple characters, I could change to a different character, but you see I've only got one, and there we are. Again, hold the control key, and you'll see my origin is in the middle there, and I'll drag the character around and position them on the screen. Finally, I'd like to add some choices. So I'm going to go up to Choices, and again, I need to create a style for them, and you'll see a very similar editor to the text box, but this creates a separate category called Choice Styles. I'm not going to use a label for these, so I'll turn that off, and now I'm going to go in and adjust my shapes. I'm going to make the shape a rounded rectangle, and I'll make it pretty decently rounded, and I do want to change the shape of that a bit, so I'm going to drag this in, and you'll notice that I'm making most of my edits around the center point of the editor. This isn't strictly speaking necessary, but when you position things, it will go by the center point. So if I were to have my box located up on a side here, it would start to get very hard to align things. So I am going to try to keep things centered, but again, it's approximate. So I'll get my button shaped about like that, and I'm even going to change its color so I can see what that looks like. I don't like the roundedness. I'm going to change that a bit until it's what I want, and we'll set that back to white. Now I've got to change my text area, so I'm going to go to Text Area, and I will center the text, and I want to change the size of that box, and squish it in so that it fits within the button that I had created. Just like that. And remember, you definitely want to define a font. That one's too big, so let's go with this one. And you can set up all your fonts, sizes, styles, italics, bold, everything back in GameMaker, and then launch the game. Now at this point I have a style for a button, but I'm actually going to create a second style while I'm here, and I want it to be just like this, but I want to define what happens to the button when I hover the mouse over it. So I'm going to go down to Add a Style, and I want to copy the current style so it's just like it, but we'll call this one Hover. And I'll click OK. So right off the bat it is identical, but now I'm going to choose my background shape and change the color, and I'll choose my text area and change the color of that, and now I'll go back to my choices. Now I can add a new choice, and I should set some things up here. So I'm going to position the choice wherever I'd like it to be, and right now it's in the normal state, and this is what it looks like, and the normal style is default. I'm going to change the state to the hover state, and the hover style is also default, but I'm going to change it to hover, and you'll see what it looks like in the hover state. We're going to put this back to normal, and now you can preview that behavior. There's my hover. Once the choice is set up basically the way that you want it to work, I'm going to create several more. So I'll just add more choices, and you'll notice that they automatically align themselves 10% below the previous box, and there are some settings you can tweak back in the code editor if you wanted to change that behavior. I do recommend getting all of the hover settings and everything set up first, because there is not, at this time, a way to batch remove those around. I could always subtract some of those choices back out and add them later, but all of the settings need to be redone if I haven't got them just the way that I want. Once my choice boxes are set up, I need to set what they do, so I can choose one of these choice boxes, that's choice 0, and I can set link 0, the register, a keyboard key, and some other interesting things. Setting a link is the most common thing you might want to do, and if I click on set link, you'll see that I can link to intro scene. That's actually the scene we've been editing this entire time, so that's not going to help me very much. I'm going to type in a scene ID. And click OK. You'll notice that now the button is highlighted to indicate that this choice has a link, and that the other two do not. There are other more advanced options we can do, like setting some stored values and conditions on the buttons, but we'll get into those another time. Before we move on, I want to set a few last options for this scene, so I'm going to go and choose a background image if I desire. For this particular scene, I don't need to, because the background I have is what I want, but you could overwrite the background of your game, which is what we're currently seeing, with any other background you want, and we'll just use the game as the background. So whatever's happening when the dialog engine opens, that's what we will see in the background. But again, you can override that. I will set a sound that I want to play, so we'll do this. And when I go ahead and click on the sound icon again, the sound stops playing. And when I click it again, I can choose another menu option, and so on. This third option for my scene stuff is something that I don't want to talk about right now, but I can set up a timer where this scene, when it comes up, will advance automatically rather than waiting for the player to click anything to continue. Now that we've created all of this, there's one more thing to do before we test. Remember, we set our first choice button to link to something called Scene 0, but there is no such thing as Scene 0, and I'm going to need to create that. So I'm going to go up to Set Scene, and I'm going to create a new scene. I'm going to type in Scene 0, and when I click OK, it will appear that very little has happened, so I'll call your attention to right up at the top where it says Scene Intro. When I click OK, here we are, Scene 0. We've now changed scenes, but what the engine has done is it's taken all of the settings from the last moment of the previous scene and copied them over. This is especially helpful if you want things to be in just about the places they were when you just came from somewhere. So you can always set your scene to wherever you want it to copy and then make a new scene. So in this new scene, I don't want these choices, for example, so I'll go and remove them. And maybe, so that I can tell something has happened, I want to change my dialogue to say something else. So I'm going to go in here and remove all of this and put in something different. Now we'll go back to our intro scene, and I can run the scene in the same way that we run GameMaker scenes in general, but instead of being in the editor, I'm here in my game, and I'm going to press F6. And as you can see, it very rapidly punched out the text. When I clicked, it punched out hello, and so we changed our scenes. The last thing that I should mention is that sometimes you'll want to change things within a scene. We've been working with only one moment at a time. I'm going to change my scene over to Scene 0, and I'm going to show you how to do multiple moments within a scene. So we're in Scene 0, Moment 0, and when I click plus New Moment, a copy of the previous moment is made. You'll see that I can go previous and next, and they look identical, but you will also see Moment 0 becomes Moment 1. Now I can make changes to this, and the engine will accommodate me. So for example, I can change my text. And then I'm also going to move my character. Character movement is automatically animated, but text box movement is not. So I'm going to grab the character, and I'm going to drag them over here, and I'm going to flip the character the other direction. While we're at it, why don't we change the expression too? So there's previous, And I need to set my expression here. Next, and there we are. So now when I run this particular scene, and as you can see, the character flipped the other way, moved to a new position, and changed expressions all in one movement. In this way you can create multiple boxes and boxes and boxes and do all kinds of fancy things. For example, I could come back to moment 0, characters, and add a second copy of a character. For now I'll just use the same one, and I'm going to position them off screen, and I'm going to align their origin right here so that I can tell what I'm doing later. I'll go to the next scene, characters, and that character is going to be here instead. When I run the scene, that second character enters from the side and they face each other. Now I ordinarily wouldn't recommend quite doing this because they actually are two characters with the same ID number, and when that happens the engine goes by the order in which they're sort of stacked here, 0 and 1, and that's how it figures out how to animate one to the other and the other to the one. So that can get a little confusing sometimes, so do try to use unique characters when you're doing this. Now the last thing that I should mention for basic game setup is that you're going to at some point want to put all of this into your final game to ship the whole result. As you're editing your game, all of your changes are being made in real time to your local app data folder in a subfolder that is whatever the name of your GameMaker project is. And you'll notice that it's making all of these files. I think the naming is generally self-explanatory. The characters is where characters information goes, styles are where the style information goes, scenes are the scenes you're making. The index is a listing of scene files. The save data is something you probably don't want to include with your game. That's going to be the save data for any choices or any conditions that get set while you're running your engine. But you can essentially grab just these files and bring them into GameMaker as included files when you're ready to ship your game. And also, when you are ready to ship your game, you would want to replace the editing object with the show object. And then you publish your game and you're ready to go.